When I last saw him, he had just graduated from high school and was constantly slender and awkward. Back when he was only his mother's son, he was absorbed in a video game or arguing with her. Someone who, aside from the courteous welcomes given over coffee in kitchens, didn't really exist in my world. But when I opened the door to my friend's house this time, I noticed that he was standing there taller and more expansive, heavier and more purposeful. I sensed a change beneath my skin. Even though it had grown older and sharper around the jaw, it wasn't his face. It was the way he gazed at me, like though he didn't recall me as a friend of his mother's, but as someone deserving of notice. He smiled first, and I answered. My friend gave me her customary greeting as my chest began to tighten for no apparent reason. Pleasant conversation, but I kept letting my gaze wander and saw how he leaned on the kitchen counter, his forearm. When he reached for a glass, his muscles stiffened, and he didn't speak because his voice had become dry and low. A lot that night, not directly to me, but he was always watching when I looked up. Not gazing, but rather observing, as he was attempting to find out more about me. I was unaware that I was giving away supper, which was informal, familiar, and full of the. He remained largely silent, answering with rehashed tales that old friends tell when they run out of genuine things to say. Smirks or half-lies that came across a bit too harshly didn't appear to be my friend's style. To notice, but when I did, I saw that the room was warmer than it should have been. I kept adjusting my blouse's neckline while being conscious of the material pressing against my collarbone, so I eventually excused myself. I went to the restroom and sprayed my wrists with cold water while I looked in the mirror and didn't. When I got back, they were finishing dessert, and he got up to assist in clearing the plates, realizing what I was trying to conceal. Before I could pick it up, he reached for mine, and his fingers briefly touched mine. After my coffee, I got up to leave my coffee just enough to make me forget what I was going to say next. A friend was discussing plans for the weekend, so I nodded and offered something informal. He stepped behind me and opened the door before I could reach the doorknob, saying, "Careful driving," as I arrived at it. I turned slightly, looking for jeering looks on his face, because he was close enough for his voice to feel like heat against my neck. Fun, but his expression was nearly unreadable, and he wasn't grinning. Unconcerned, he said, "The fact that you live so close makes things more complex." With that, he took a step back, leaving the door open, and at last he looked somewhere else in the car. I convinced myself that the young man's hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel was nothing more than a cunning test. Boundaries that didn't exist yet. When I took off my clothes in the restroom that evening, I discovered that I was viewing my own body in a new way, not critically, nor even interestingly, but with a certain level of attentiveness. I swept my fingers over my collarbone in a way I hadn't felt in years, just like I'd seen his gaze do before. I stopped and looked at the white lace I hadn't worn in months in my underwear drawer. My husband was already in a state of anticipation when something sparked in me, not a recollection. He was reading on his tablet in bed, half drowsy, when he looked up and grinned for a moment. I lay next to him, still silent, and turned back to the screen. He was half dressed, so he either didn't notice or maybe did, and decided not to ask. Recently, we practiced being tactful and considerate when avoiding things we couldn't fully identify I relived the scene at the door. Dark, his voice near my ear, the silence before he spoke, and I knew he would be. I tried not to acknowledge it, but I also knew that I would see him again. I turned on my side, facing away from my surroundings, and a part of me wished for that more than anything else I had wanted in weeks. I gently pressed my thighs together, hubby, but it wasn't exactly out of want. I believed that what I had was the aftertaste of being noticed. been absent the entire time, and I didn't intend to see him again so quickly. Since that night, the thought had persisted, slipping into the more sedate moments of my days as I was doing the laundry. Even with my spouse standing next to me while I was brushing my teeth and preparing supper, it wasn't the kind of idea It was pleasant, yet it seemed like static beneath the surface, like a lamp left on low, occurring in a different room. Yet life's subtle cruelty seems to recognize when whatever I recall that it was a Tuesday, since it was washing day and you are shifting inside. I had left the house in a sloppy cotton dress with my hair tied back and no makeup. I went to my friend's house to return a baking dish that I had dropped off, but it was loose and forgettable. Didn't intend to remain. Instead, I entered through the back door as usual without knocking beforehand. I paused in the hallway with the dish in hand, but the house was still empty. I was about to leave it on the counter and go back out without anyone noticing, but he was there. Heard him. He abruptly materialized at the kitchen's edge, barefoot and carrying a "Hey!" He replied, his voice gruff, from awakening his coffee mug, eyes still groggy. "Didn't listen to you enter." "I was just dropping this off," I said hastily, raising the dish a little, as though that clarified everything, and he entered the kitchen, leaning his t-shirt against the counter. Seemed to have just gotten out of bed, since he clung in spots that made it difficult to keep my eyes where they belonged. I felt silly for a moment, as I stood there, married, not dressed for company. Holding a plate resembling the suburban cliché, "You want coffee?" He was almost twice his age. I should have said no when he asked, but I nodded since I knew that. Moved slowly and unconcernedly, standing with my arms crossed at the kitchen's edge and acting as though, as he poured, he handed me the cup, and I noticed how close he stood. Our fingers briefly touched again. Didn't feel random. It persisted, and we stood there facing one another rather than sitting. I sipped my coffee in the silence of that all-too-familiar kitchen. He claimed to be studying me, but I didn't mind because I wasn't expecting company. "You always that spontaneous?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Are you planning to stay?" He smiled and said, "How comfortable are you always walking around half-dressed? Depends on who's watching." Silence once more, nothing unpleasant or heavy. His eyes shifted from my face, till I felt the air shift between us, dense and still, as my collarbone then lowered. I asked, "Should you go?" But I remained motionless as he put down his mug. He stepped out before I could say anything dismissive or light enough to flutter out of the room. With each stride, I got closer until my back reached the edge of through the thin fabric of my garment. The chill of the kitchen counter shocked my skin. "I've thought about you," he murmured, standing uncomfortably close to me without touching me. Perhaps because he was young, bold, and irresponsible, the remarks struck more forcefully than they should have. However, his voice was honest rather than haughty, and that hurt me more than anything else may have prevented me from responding, and his hand was raised almost languidly. And he lightly caressed my jaw with the back of his fingers, not in a possessive manner. Skin burned where he went, and then he leaned in slowly enough for me to could have prevented it by pulling it away and laughing it off, but instead I cocked my. Without thinking, his eyes fluttered shut before his lips touched mine. The kiss was rapid, intense, and all-consuming rather than gentle or tentative. You can imagine that my hands were unsure of where to go when I struck a match and watched it catch. One of them found his chest. I tasted coffee and something else, while someone else held onto the counter's edge. Something urgent, younger than I recall, that lasted for a few seconds. Perhaps for a longer time, I withdrew my heart, pounding, and my first breath caught in my throat. He looked at me with eyes darker than before, but I remained motionless and muttered, "I can't." I heard footsteps outside, possibly a car door, and the moment was captured. I took 2 steps back, almost toppling the dish, and put it down too forcefully. I stated again, my voice trembling, "I have to leave the counter," and I detested that he could. He only nodded slowly as I heard it. "See you." I got into the car and grasped the steering wheel as I walked out of the home without turning around, wheel so firmly that my knuckles widened and my pulse was all over my ears. Back home, I placed my dress in the waist like this to clear the gap between my legs. It had deceived me. I had transformed into something soft and uninteresting. When my husband returned home later, I walked around the house like a ghost, avoiding my reflection. I flinched as he kissed my cheek more than usual, but he either feigned not to notice or didn't notice. When he reached for me in bed that night, I let him because his hands felt comfortable. I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to block out the recollection of another hand, another tongue, even though I knew his rhythm. When it was ended, I mentioned that I was exhausted. I curled away from him, feeling pleased, and held a pillow to my stomach as if it might stop. Despite the pain, I didn't cry or feel guilty, just an odd sense of fullness. It was more than simply a kiss. It was a beginning, as if something had burst open inside of me, and I wasn't prepared to close it. And I believed that ignoring it would be simple, but I knew that I would allow it to happen again. Could put the recollection in a private, inaccessible place inside of me and continue as if nothing had changed. Prior to suppressed disappointments, unfulfilled needs, and even unspoken, by this point resentments were essentially muscle memory, but this was different. The contour of his mouth on mine and the pressure of his fingers close to my lips had left an impression on my skin, but I could still feel him in the heat that blossomed beneath my garments and taste him in the mornings, saw my mirror and attempted to ignore it, telling myself it had been an error, a pointless luxury, but I still ended up finding myself. I hesitated as I went by his street, lowering my speed and keeping an eye out for his vehicle, questioning whether he recalled it the same way I did. Stinging electric danger, I pretended to have headaches in order to avoid going to my friend's place for days. Claimed errands, but she was too preoccupied with her own preparations to examine it. Her job and her constant discussion about remodeling and vacation plans, but I knew I couldn't continue indefinitely, would need to confront him once more. Whether they chose to act or not, it was nearly a relief when I encountered him in a completely neutral location, the local I was packing, after completing a session at the community center, where I volunteered twice a month for a reading program. He was wearing a jacket over a black shirt and pants, and his hair was up when I noticed him in the hallway, chatting with someone close to the entrance. Though a little tousled, he appeared normal and pleasant, yet I felt everything light up at the A. Hurriedly turned away when he noticed me, and our eyes locked. He didn't grin. Before he spoke, I could hear his footsteps coming, while I pretended to be preoccupied with the stack of papers in my hands. He asked nonchalantly, "Volunteering now?" I looked up, always had. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching me with that same unreadable expression, "Didn't expect to see you here." There was also a beat of stillness before I departed. I scowled as he drew out a folded piece for you, sheet paper from his jacket, and placed it on the table's edge. I had a quick query. I didn't reach for it any farther. Instead, I saw how his fingers. "You could have texted me," I said, "but you lingered against the wood for too long. To sound unconcerned, you blocked me." He responded without resentment, simply stating that I didn't respond. Took a step back, keeping his eyes on mine, and then departed, leaving behind his clean, sharp, slightly metallic scent, was the only hint of whatever fragrance he was wearing. Waited a full minute before grabbing the paper, and his penmanship was straightforward, rushed yet readable. Would you agree to see me again, just to talk? I delicately folded it and slipped it into my bag without a name time or pressure. All the way home, with my heart racing, as if I had just committed a crime, I reminded myself not to reply, because I had already left. Far enough to need to end yet that evening after my spouse had gone to sleep, breathing slowly next to me, and even after taking out the note once more, I read it in the gentle light from my bedside lamp, and then I discovered that I was writing a response on the back, practically without, I didn't do anything more than think yes once. I had a good night's sleep, but my nightmares were filled with fragmented pictures of his face, too near to the sound of tearing paper. As my husband's voice called out to me from another room, I felt as though something had been scraped clean out of me when I woke up. On my morning stroll, I placed the message in an envelope and left it in the mailbox, close to his building, but I didn't. I told myself I didn't know whether he would even find it, so I waited for an answer. 2 days later, I got a message from someone we both knew who was from the center, but didn't know what. They were only reminding everyone that he will be in the cafe next to the I should have known better than to go to the park on Friday at around 4, just in case he wanted to stop by. But when the time came, I was standing in front of the mirror, attempting to put on a blouse that I hadn't worn in years. Low collar sleeves made of cream cloth that encircled my arms, and I selected earrings that I wore perfume, which I generally save for anniversaries, and it dangled slightly when I tilted my head. My gut was knotted with anxiety by the time I entered the cafe, but my hands were firm and he was there. He was drinking coffee at a little table by the window, looking up as I walked up to him without using his phone. Then I noticed something new in his countenance for the first time, not mischief nor assurance, but more akin to appreciation. "Hi," I replied, slipping into the chair across from him. "You came, I said I would," and he nodded while observing me. "Different but excellent," he grinned as the awkward talk began. We discussed pointless topics like how the town had altered the weather and his temporary position at a design firm. But every time he leaned in, I felt my breath catch because the air between us surged with unspoken truths beneath every syllable. He didn't mention the kiss, but every time his knee touched mine beneath the table, I lost the flow of my own words. I didn't either, but as I was reaching for my coat at the conclusion, he replied, "You know I froze, wondering what second question you never answered it." He held, "Would you want it to happen again?" I asked. I gave him a heart-stopping look. I stood gently smoothing the surface, and he said, "I didn't ask it out loud, but I think you heard it anyway." He cocked his head and said, "And what makes you think I didn't already answer? Because you're still." The sidewalk was gold-painted by the late afternoon light outside, and although the air was chilly, my skin heated beneath my blouse that night. I stood there and walked home without pausing or turning around. Before going to bed, I touched the earrings that were still hanging from my ears in front of the mirror once more and took off my blouse. My husband called from the bedroom to ask if I had folded it properly and put it back in the drawer like a secret. Replied, "Yes," but I wasn't sure whether I had gone to bed when I turned off the lights below. Beside him, I could still smell the cafe's aroma and hear the echo of a question I had answered without using words. However, because I had already arrived and knew I wouldn't be leaving, I didn't let him know I would be there. There was no message, no confirmation, and no justification. Ready in case I decided against it, but on Saturday morning, when I was already considering what I would wear, as I was still loading the dishes in the kitchen when the unexpected thought struck. Similar to how we could check the weather or see if we have enough milk or another natural fluid. Risky, since I had been thinking about him all since the cafe, and his question had lingered in my mind. I went through my routine like a fog, with my thoughts obscuring things I used to notice clearly. Well-programmed me, doing laundry, running errands, and having courteous discussions with neighbors, but below it was something that sparked not shame or remorse, simply the by noon. With a building sense of suspense, I stood in front of my closet, uncertain about whether or not to dress. I picked a white blouse that I hadn't worn in years for him or myself, since it seemed I wore it with fitted jeans and short heels because it was too light and silky against my skin, and a coat that I told my husband I was wearing just when I wanted to feel invisible. I was meeting a buddy for coffee when he inquired if I would be returning by dinner without looking up from his laptop. I replied that I wasn't sure. This day the cafe was farther away than usual, not even near to our home, a somewhat neutral location, upscale, more sedate, and when I entered, he was already sat 2 cups in front of. He studied me gently from head to toe without immediately smiling. "You wore white," he continued, returning to my face with that expression that stayed in my chest. "Sat down. You responded without saying a word, and you asked for it without asking. Word." I saw his hand movements as he reached for his coffee, recalled how they had held onto the counter's edge during our previous brief conversation about informal topics, such his leg touched mine beneath the table, and neither of us moved away. Yet it was always just enough to appear innocuous. Wasn't anticipated what would happen next, or perhaps we both had. Somewhere in the quietness, we silently agreed that the time had come long before we acknowledged it. He stood up first and said he wanted to show me something from a neighboring small gallery. He said I followed the pop-up event because I didn't believe him, but rather because I wanted to take a quick stroll around the block, but each step made me gasp. Shallower. He didn't touch me or give me more attention than was required, but I could. The gallery was closed, and I could feel the tension between us growing like static, stopped in front of it, and gave me a quick, faint smirk. Well, I leaned against the wall and folded my arms, which was disappointing because you knew it would be. Perhaps there was a long pause before he moved closer just to have his hand extend. As he brushed a lock of hair away from my cheek and stayed there, his thumb lightly touched the line of my jaw. He said, I didn't stop him because I didn't want to be careful, muttered, "Don't rush the kiss this time." It developed gradually like something. Recalled rather than found, his mouth definitely found mine, yet my hands moved without haste. I felt everything, including his breath, as his fingers curled against the fabric on his chest. Pulsate the heat between us without requesting permission. We remained silent, since there was nothing we could say that would make it any less than it already was. Then we turned to return to the cafe. I remained near him without touching him, but my heart pounded as if I had been racing. He gave me a single fleeting gaze for miles, and it was evident to me that he felt the weight of what it signified as much as the heat of the kiss. I got in my car and drove home. The white blouse continued to cling to my body as a reminder of how the air felt at home. After setting the table, lighting the candles, and pouring the wine, my husband grinned. I thought we could have a nice meal when I stepped in, proud of his gesture. He mentioned it had been a long, and I stood. I felt the contrast like a slap in the face as I stood in the doorway longer than I should have. I wanted to feel something from the tenderness of his voice and the warmth of his effort. I changed my clothing earlier because I felt empty instead of grateful, affectionate, or even guilty. He advised me to sit down, wear something looser, and wash the smell off my wrists. He listened to me while he asked me questions regarding his job issues from the previous week and planned meetings. After supper, I allowed him to touch my hand across the table after I responded. He stood behind me at the sink and put his arms around my waist as we silently cleared the plates, and I tensed up. He kissed my neck just a little and whispered something about missing this, so I made he reached for me once more this time, and I smiled back. We went to bed early. I kissed him back and let him slowly undress me, thinking that perhaps I could fill the void by acting as though nothing had changed, but I couldn't resist contrasting his mouth with another's. Rhythm to a different beat, and his hands, who were so familiar with my body, stopped asking for my permission. I lay awake for a long time after the room smelt like ours, as he dozed off, drawing invisible lines on my thigh. I missed the past shared sheets, old rituals and laundry, foreign, and I finally gave up trying to tell myself that wanting it was wrong, because the truth was easier. I needed it more than that, not for the excitement or I needed to feel alive again, and he had satisfied that desire for secrecy. I closed my eyes and didn't dream because I felt that it was the only thing worth protecting. There are mornings that arrive gentle and empty, like a blank slate before the first word, because I was already living it. As stated, Monday was one of those days when I woke up before the sun rose and the sky was still My husband stirred next to me, but didn't wake up, leaving me with a bruise of blue and gray. I wondered how many versions of me he thought he really knew as I watched his back rise and fall. He was still asleep when I entered the shower and stood under the hot water, and I never noticed him moving farther away, letting the water drip down my chest and sting my shoulders for longer than required. I thought of how I'd kissed someone else outside of a closed space as I leaned my forehead against the tile. Gallery 2 days prior, I considered how much I wanted it again, but not right now. But the way it returned me to the bedroom, I opened and made me feel indisputable. I paused before reaching for the typical cotton or beige lace and took something out of my underwear drawer, distinct a deep crimson set silk that was hardly there for comfort, but rather choosing to wear a black skirt that hung down at my hips. I dressed more thoughtfully that morning than I had in months. Without expressing regret, I threw a coat over a fitting shirt that exposed my collarbones. He had once asked me in a low voice, almost teasingly, what scent I was wearing loosely over my shoulders. I wore it now to remember his voice rather than to answer the question. I told my husband I had errands to run when he asked, and I gave him a cheek kiss in the he grinned, like a man who was wearing shaving foam and orange peels in the corridor. Still held the opinion that the meeting spot wasn't romantic. On typical days, it was a rest area along the highway, 20 minutes out of town. He had casually mentioned it in a mail the evening before, a minor show. I knew it wasn't about the art, so the Heritage Museum would be an acceptable explanation. His car was already there when I got there, and he was leaning against it with his hands in his pockets and his sunglasses pushed up into his hair. He simultaneously appeared too youthful and self-assured, and I detested that before my mind could even process it, my body responded. "You came," he whispered, stepping forward of naturally, I responded. We went past rooms filled with antique farming implements, and we hardly even glanced at the old photos. We were just two persons feigning to pass the time while strolling. He didn't touch me, but I could feel it as we moved through a space where neither of us cared about holding ourselves back with each breath. Establishing the quiet in between sentences, the fleeting looks, and the way his body always. In the last room, a little video appeared to be a bit closer than it should have been. A movie on historic train routes was shown repeatedly throughout the artwork. The kind folks hardly ever I mentioned something regarding the watch while we stood in the distant corner out of sight. He mentioned missing the moment in the soundtrack and then abruptly turned to face me. "This is driving." He murmured softly, "I think about you all the time," and I gulped, feeling the "you shouldn't." He continued, "And the floor should be a little lower than me. Here we are," and I simply moved closer without responding. He didn't ask, and I didn't. This time, the kiss was different. There was no uncertainty or wonder about it. Months of self-control were now coming undone by the heat and hunger, and his hand slid under. I gave him a deeper kiss as my coat fingertips brushed the curve of my back and then pressed firmly into the area just above my hips. Then I intended to, as if I wanted to close the gap between my previous self and my current self. His forehead rested against mine as he drew back, breathing irregularly at first. He muttered, "You won't want to stop if we keep doing this. I already don't." So I insisted we stayed, there for a while just breathing, and then we walked out of the museum without saying anything, since the wind had taken up my coat whipped open a little, and I sat in the car without caring who saw. He drove slowly, while I held my hands in my lap and gazed out the window, one hand on the "at a red light," with one wheel resting at the gear shift near my knee. I turned to him and said, "Let's go somewhere next weekend, just a day out of town." "Why?" "Since I want to spend time with you without acting like we're doing something else." Didn't respond right away because I was preoccupied with the logistics, the danger, and the stories I would have to share. However, my husband was waiting for me on the balcony that evening with a wine glass in his hand, and my heart had already said yes. Give him a new book in the other, and when he inquired how my day went, I said that it had been long. He kissed my forehead, informed me that dinner was almost done, and we ate by candlelight once more. He expressed his pride at how he remarked that I looked stunning in black and that I had been involved in the community, grinned when he reached for me in bed later that evening, and I allowed his hands to move. I answered just enough slowly and deliberately, making the appropriate noises and maintaining my body posture. Although I was comfortable beneath him, I was completely somewhere in that dim gallery corner, sensing the touch of silk over my skin, tasting something new, and hearing someone else speak my. After that, I curled up and stared at the ceiling as if my name mattered. I only felt alert and knew that next weekend will come, but I didn't cry or feel bad. In the days that followed, I would act precisely as I was supposed to. Prepared dinner, folded towels, responded to emails, and arranged an appointment at the dentist. Filled the backyard bird feeder and picked up the dry washing. If anyone had inquired, people stated that I appeared happy, and my husband even made a remark about it during breakfast one morning, saying that I was lighter. He grinned as he said it, and I grinned back, growing better at. Although I was wearing comfort like a second skin, I was actually in a different place. That corridor once more, his lips on mine, his fingertips on my back. As we traveled in the direction of nothing in particular, he watched trees in the passenger seat of his car blur by. The longer I stayed in the secret, the more it seemed to be the only place where I was really. Although I hadn't made up my mind yet, I knew I would accompany him that weekend. It wasn't about running away. Suddenly, it was obvious that I had discovered a different side of myself, and I didn't want to allow her to depart. But even as I prepared for what lay ahead, I reminded myself that I needed to make amends at home, or at the very least show up. I volunteered to book supper for Saturday night, even though I knew we wouldn't save them. I told my husband that I might go to the city to see my sister. He nodded, but he wasn't pressing. For specifics, I pondered whether he secretly detected something, but if so, he buried. And on Thursday, I met his mother, a friend, to whom she had extended an invitation. As usual, she had a casual lunch and discussed her job. And she didn't tell him about the recipe she intended to try on her next trip. Once, but his aroma persisted subtly throughout the entire house. His voice reverberated in the rear door while a pair of his shoes sat on the couch pillows. My memories and I saw that I kept looking toward the corridor. She offered me coffee, and I accepted her hands. I convinced myself it was simply caffeine before I shook a little as I lifted the cup. After I left, she led me to the door and inquired about my well-being. Her tone had somewhat changed, but it was still not suspicious. Naturally, I smiled too quickly, wondering why it wouldn't be her. She might even be gentle. "You look different lately, like you're thinking a lot," she added, after tilting her head and studying me for too long. "Lot." I chuckled uncontrollably. Perhaps I am she. I left her house feeling vulnerable, in a way I hadn't anticipated, after she lightly touched my arm, fearing it might be hazardous. Her remarks echoed in my head the whole way home, making me wonder if she was dangerous, or perhaps she did. Women can sense changes in the atmosphere, even if they are unable to identify them. That evening, I packed a tiny bag. I kissed my husband goodnight, and I told him about my sister once more. The following morning, he departed early, and he laid next to him, with his dark eyes wide open and his heart thumping against the mattress. I waited till the door had closed for 15 minutes before getting dressed for work. I put on the low heels, a dress he had never seen before, the same red underwear, and a little cosmetics. I looked like a version of myself because I hadn't worn it in months. He picked me up at the edge of town from where I had buried myself a long time ago. Initially, we merely drove windows slightly open, with wind in our hair, without saying anything. Halfway to the next city, a gentle, forgettable tune was played on the radio. Reached for my hand and I gave it to him, but I held on to it while staring out the window. We came to a calm, unassuming little coastal village where we settled into a bed and brunch that had a salty and lavender scent. The woman behind the counter inquired if we were celebrating anything, and he said that we were. Didn't correct him. We strolled through small neighborhoods, shared a bottle of water, and ate lunch by the water. He asked me questions about wine under a canvas umbrella that he had never asked me before. My early years, my regrets, and the dreams I had when I was unable to sleep, I replied. Sincerely, I wanted to hear myself speak honestly for him, not because I owed him anything. He listened to me with a level of concentration I hadn't experienced in years, and he chuckled at my cynicism was tested by sarcasm, which frequently caressed my knee under the table. Enough to make me gasp, but we didn't share another kiss that day or make any more than casual contact in public. Something solid and indisputable developed between us that evening at the inn. After standing in front of the mirror for a while, I carefully removed my dress and looked. I heard him knock once, as though I was seeing myself for the first time in my reflection. Gently on the bedroom door, and instead of responding immediately, I pushed my fingers to my stomach and closed I finally opened my eyes after feeling the weight of every choice that had brought me this far. The door he stood there without saying anything or smiling, so I moved aside to let him in. We sat at the edge of the bed shoulders, brushing the air without making contact. "I don't want to ruin your life," he whispered abruptly as we pumped, and I looked too. He stared at me for a while before saying, "I want more." I told him, "Then don't." I nodded that night when we laid next to each other, even though I wasn't sure if he meant more time with me or something else. I realized something I hadn't ventured to before when we whispered bits of ourselves into the darkness while completely clothed. Admit that previously it wasn't about the physical. Rather, it was about being well known, Selected and isolated in that tiny rented room, I felt as though I belonged to something again, but not to him or anyone else. I thought that would be the final instance of the unspoken silent agreement, but floating in the pauses between our talks for a short weekend away, escape after which we would resume our respective lives, me, my spouse, and he followed whatever notion of normal he could to ensure the safety of the structure. For him after me. Nevertheless, on Sunday as we were leaving, he kissed the top of my hand rather than my lips and held I knew he had just opened a deeper door by Monday morning, as he had opened it without touching the small of my back. Returned to the routine of my household life with the kettle boiling at 7:10. Like clockwork, the neighbor's dog barked at 9, and the washing machine spun at 8:15, yet I felt like I was moving. Like a borrowed body, I made the right moves and smiled when my husband automatically gave me a cheek kiss, complimented my hair, and asked if I wanted to organize anything for the weekend. I replied, he didn't push, but the part of me that had emerged in that peaceful beach setting said, let's see how the week goes. He had left behind a town that had refused to close the part that had breathed next to him in bed without having to talk. I carried it under my skin like a secret, a version of myself I didn't realize I needed. 3 days went by without any messages or invitations. I didn't anticipate receiving one. I convinced myself that I needed the space, so I folded it into myself like a white sheet. Comforting, but by Thursday the quiet had shifted. It was no longer space. My spine began to ache uncomfortably, and it got tighter with weight. He didn't call me every hour that night, so I wandered aimlessly through the streets I'd known for years, but the store's lampposts and bushes felt strange to them. Cut just enough to make everything appear faded, like props in a life. I didn't want to go to the park, but as I walked there, my shoes clicked lightly against the pavement. Just took me, and I sat on a bench along the path under a line of trees with sparse branches. The first scents of moist autumn leaves were transported by the wind. I tightened my coat in response to smoke coming from an invisible source and sat motionless while occasionally hearing the rustle of joggers' dogs. Chats passing by, and then I noticed him, but he wasn't approaching me. Stood by the pond's side, hands in his pockets, observing the water ripples without even glancing in my direction. With a kind of motionlessness that was painful to observe, I didn't move. However, something must have informed him of some unseen thread or current of attention. He turned slowly, and our eyes locked. He approached without grinning, sat next to me without hesitation, as if everything had been planned and nothing was left undone. I thought I'd see you, he replied, and I gave him a confused look. Why are you here? He turned to face me and shrugged, saying, I come here, sometimes think you same. We sat there for a bit, and I let out a breath that, depending on how you heard it, could have been a laugh or a sob. Without saying anything, the sun lowered, bathing his face in amber light. He appeared older in that way, perhaps due to a desire that was etched into his face rather than age. I'm leaving at the end of next week because I found a job, or I know he broke the silence first. Something dropped inside of me, like a stone in water, when I received the offer in Denver. I asked for a long time, and he shook his head, possibly permanently. I turned away. My throat clenched, but I wasn't going to tell you just yet. Believed that it would be simpler for the person he didn't respond to instead. He took a folded note out of his coat pocket and held it between his palms instead of giving it to me. He placed the paper on his fingers and added, If you want to see me again before I go. I glanced down at the note that said, It has to be your choice, on the bench between us. He stood slowly, pausing when the wind pulled at the edge, but I clamped my fingers over the corner to keep it motionless. I don't want to be another thing you have to lie about, but don't regret anything he said. About, and he left. I looked at the message, but I didn't examine it properly. I remained on that bench until the sky turned violet and the bulbs began to flicker one by one. At last, when I unfurled it, it was only a 3-word address with no explanations. I tucked it in my coat pocket and took a slower than normal stroll home that evening. I lay beside my spouse and listened to his steady breathing instead of sleeping. I examined the soft indentation of his wedding band and the form of his hand as it lay on the blanket. I pondered whether he had touched me uncontrollably the previous time we had spent a late night talking. He kissed me goodbye before work in the morning, and he never realized how much I had vanished while standing right next to him. When I told him I didn't want anything from the store, he walked away, leaving me to sit at the kitchen table, the message open before me, my fingers repeatedly following the script as if it would show me something I hadn't seen previously. I wasn't sure if I would go, but I suspected I couldn't lie that I hadn't seen him again because of this. Didn't matter. Certain life events don't come with a pomp and circumstance. Thunderous heavens, no breathtaking discoveries, only the silent assurance that no matter what occurs next, you've sitting at the kitchen table that morning with his note in front of me. I had already passed the point of return. The paper felt warm between my fingertips, like though his hand's heat was still there, and I knew I had arrived. The familiar, sharp, slightly slanted handwriting didn't shake mine when I read the address. Once more at 40 on a Saturday, with only one phrase and no emotion, there a door with a jar left inside, but it wasn't completely open. If I intended to go through it, it would spend the majority of the day on my own terms. I folded towels and moved as though I were underwater. I refolded them 3 times, and then twice more as I moved from room to room, carrying a mug of I felt something, but I didn't scream or panic over tea that had long since gone cold. More difficult to describe anything more akin to mourning than what I was going to lose, but for the version of myself I couldn't be anymore. I practiced I would explain it to myself by saying that it had been genuine, but brief. If I had a fever, something to keep hidden, but not pursue, I would go back to the comfort of familiarity, the gradual waning of feelings, and the peaceful coziness of a marriage that had long since I would make a sincere effort to forget what it was like to be in the shape of stillness, desired without responsibility. Yet the more I visualized that life, the more restrictive That night, I sat next to my husband in bed while he silently read the lamp. I saw his lips move a little as I put soft shadows on his face. I tried to recall by following the lines of a page while holding his hand on his thigh and tucking one finger between chapters. I attempted to evoke the warmth I knew we once shared, but I couldn't compare it to how it felt to touch him. Our early years' memories, albeit distant, are still there, his breath against my neck, when he murmured that he didn't deserve me. My voice cracked, so I turned off my light and rolled onto my side, and he followed. He kissed my shoulder a few minutes after his arm touched mine, but we didn't say anything. I lay awake, eyes wide open, already drifting absently, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, till the first rays of light appeared through the blinds. The following day went without incident. I spent it on dancing grocery shopping and other routines related to design, replying to messages, stopping at stoplights for longer than required, and not taking another look at the note I had previously committed, the address to memory. So when Saturday came, I told my spouse that I wanted some alone time and that I was going to see an art exhibit. He kissed my temple and whispered, "Take your time," suggesting that we visit a bookshop afterwards, and I did. The road was familiar, and I drove out of town without music or a GPS. My hands were solid on the wheel, but my gut churned with something that wasn't the destination. Nerves need, and the knowledge that this was no longer about him was about me, and the home was silent and low on the edge of a lonely woodland walk, yet not remote a rental that is undoubtedly short-term, such as I pulled into the driveway, I waited there as the dirt crunched beneath my tires. I kept the key in my hand while the engine was off for a full minute before getting out. Before I knocked, he opened the door and we didn't talk at first. Putting him aside, I moved past him into a small room with a couch and a few books piled on the wall that was lighted by diffused afternoon light. He hadn't made it appear lived in by leaving a bag half-zipped close to the window. He stood behind me for a while, without trying to romanticize things, which gave me comfort. I didn't think you would come, but for a moment you were simply breathing and not touching. Stated, I almost didn't, but you did. Turned to look at him, and sure enough, our quiet seemed different now, not heavy nor hesitant. Filled with everything we no longer needed to discuss, I sat on the couch's edge, and he joined me, leaving assess the distance between us by placing his hand open palm down on the cushion. I'm not sure what I mean when I say that I'm not demanding anything. I won't ask you to sit like this since I know what will happen after today. But after a while, the weight of our presence became too much, so I leaned back and softly exhaled something I had never done before. I chose the falsified number myself before I spoke. That brought a gentle, almost melancholy grin on his face. He reached across and eventually took my hand. In the same manner that he had previously, his thumb stroked lightly along the edge of my wrist. Touched my mouth back in the kitchen before all of this, saying, I want you must understand. He added that this need not turn into something else in order to be significant. I told him that was the issue, and he kissed me without urgency. He was definitely hungry, and I kissed him back. Later, we lay on the couch with our legs intertwined. I remained silent as my head rested on his chest, and his fingers silently brushed my arm. Strokes. We didn't discuss goodbyes or the future. Instead, we just existing in suspension together. And at one point, he inquired if he didn't dispute when I shook my head that I needed to go home, even though he wanted to stay the night. He held my hand in the small of my back as if it had always been there as he escorted me to my car, and the sky had turned the dark and luscious, the color of damaged fruit. I opened, the door stopped, and glanced up at him. Will you give me a call? I asked whether you wanted me to, but I didn't respond. I simply entered. That evening I drove back to my house and saw the porch light after closing the door. Still on to the spouse who waited and asked about dinner while giving a gentle kiss. I smiled and asked him about his day before slipping into bed next to him. Body still retaining the warmth of another person's breath, and for the first time I felt complete rather than torn. For a little period I thought that going back meant going back. That if I returned home and re-entered this life, this home, this marriage, I would in some way undo what had occurred, as though his absence could purify our presence. But I now know better than to. You bring things back with you that are silent or invisible, so don't go back the same. A quick look at the outline of a name you no longer utter out loud, and in some way, you was able to squeeze them into the tiny areas between pouring the morning coffee and making the bed, such as the days that followed were the most routine I had experienced in months, yet they were also the most uncomfortable. The radio buzzed as normal, and the kitchen smelled of dish soap and basil. Soft news. My spouse inquired about books and movies I hadn't seen, replied with nods, partial responses, and well-placed grins. I didn't lie. I just let the silences speak louder than the truth in the conventional sense, but I kept the final picture of him standing in the doorway of that rental home, his hand still warm amid the silence. His expression seemed to be memorizing something that he was afraid to ask me for. I didn't tell him not to call, and he didn't tell me to either. I convinced myself that it was better that we had discussed what needed to be discussed. Moment had gone by, or at least it had settled in a room for a long time like dust. My friend called his mother one afternoon without any interruptions, and her voice was, as it had consistently been, warm and practiced with a bustling energy that kept. Before the questions could be resolved, he went. She said, "The Denver job came. Unpacked over the weekend and left by Monday, as you were aware." Yes, I also said that. She said, "Are you okay?" In an odd way. She paused and said, "Given that I wasn't the one saying goodbye, I'm fine." He claimed you were nice to him, and there was a statement in her voice that wasn't accusatory or inquisitive. I said, "I tried to be," and we ended as I floated out into the open, hopefully allowing me to hang. She didn't hit the ceremonial call button, but I listened to her words for hours. I wanted to chuckle after you showed him kindness, since it hadn't felt like the proper word, not in the sense that I wanted to take him away from him after touching him, but maybe it was because I had met him there and never attempted to claim him. It felt like permission to live more freely for a week in that peaceful environment where nobody belonged to anyone. He didn't call after that, and I didn't write, not because I didn't want to. However, since our creation was not able to be stretched into a different shape, it wasn't intended for translation or distance. It had existed in that one evening my spouse and I watched a single-season short burning, complete in its incompleteness. Long after the sun had fallen, he came out onto the porch and leaned against the railing to find me sitting there with a glass of wine, silently observing me for a minute. "You've changed," he said, and I stared. "I'm not sure, but you're quieter. Not depressed, but I didn't respond elsewhere because I wasn't sure how to. Tell him everything and nothing at once, that I had just uncovered the truth and that he had done nothing wrong. Lack of something I didn't realize I was missing until I sensed it once more. He sat next to me, and I can tell his hand found mine. He added, "I thought you liked the quiet I thought we were in. I've let things go." He nodded and added, "I just don't want to." I continued, "and maybe we still are, to lose you." I turned to face him, and he appeared worn out, but not from age or labor. "You haven't lost me," I murmured, searching for something inside of me that I no longer wore on the outside, and it wasn't a lie. But he hadn't completely located me either. As I wasn't fit in, I no longer felt like I belonged there, especially in the way I picked out my underwear today, with purpose, even if no one could see it in the manner I entered a room, knowing my own body not for its appearance, but for the sensation of it when I touched my husband, not out of obligation, but voluntarily, purposefully, and slowly, even if my thoughts would occasionally wander. So the next night I made love to him tenderly and more fully than I had, and he cried for months after not crying at all, only quiet tears that rolled up. He held me closer than normal, as though he too realized that something had changed, that none of us could identify, and I let him to embrace me instead of stopping him, believe whatever narrative he felt compelled to accept. And then I stood by myself in the restroom, with the mirror reflecting only I didn't despise myself or love myself more, despite the edges of my physique. Anything but I recognized myself when I passed the edge of the same thing that weekend. The leaves had started to fall crisply in the park where we had first met by chance. Curling at the edges, I walked past the bench we had used together and took a seat without realizing anyone else was there. For me yet, I sensed him there, not by my side, not in a romantic spectral manner, but when he first remarked, careful driving, a void appeared within of me. Thank you not for the whisper which was just loud enough for the wind to carry, a fare but for bringing me back to myself, even if only temporarily. Once,